If you're teaching music online and it feels harder than it should, you're probably making one simple mistake. It's not the technology. It's a mistake that makes teaching online feel more frustrating, more exhausting, and less effective than it should. I've taught hundreds of students online, and I'm going to show you what this mistake is, how to fix it, and how fixing it will not only make teaching online easy and enjoyable, but can also make you more money. So often when people say online teaching doesn't work, they point to the same things, right? You're not in the same room with the student. You can't play together properly. It feels a little awkward. It's less natural. There's latency and glitches. And yeah, some of that is true. Online is definitely different, but it's not the real reason it feels worse. The real problem is that most teachers take an in-person lesson and just drag it onto the screen with the same structure, same expectations, and same 1 hour a week and hope for the best approach. And it just doesn't work like that. When you try and teach online the same way you taught in person, the tech becomes your enemy. Audio lags, microphones don't work, cameras can feel clunky. You spend half the session setting things up instead of actually helping the student. So it feels worse and you assume that the format is the problem, but it's not. The issue isn't online teaching. It's that online teaching sucks when you try to make it behave the same way as an in-person lesson. In-person teaching relies on being in the room, obviously. Online teaching relies on structure. And if you don't change the structure, you're basically guaranteed to have a bad experience. Once you stop trying to replicate in-person and instead use online for what it's actually good at, the whole thing starts to make a lot more sense. Before we get into specifically what actually makes online teaching better and more effective, we need to be on the same page about one thing. Student progress doesn't come from the lesson itself. It comes from what the student does in between the lessons. You know this already, right? If a student doesn't practice, they're just not going to get better. So when you think about what you're really offering as a teacher, it's not just the lesson itself, it's the student's practice. Everything you do should be geared towards maximizing the chance that they actually practice. And that means giving them clarity, removing any guesswork, making it obvious what they're meant to work on, making it doable, and it has to fit the time they actually have available during the week. Different students are going to have different amounts of time, so the structure has to match their reality, not just an ideal version of it. This is where online teaching starts to make a bit more sense because the online session isn't the product. The session sets up the week. It's there to give the student a clear structure so when they sit down to practice, they know exactly what to do. And when practice is clear, it definitely feels easier to start. So they'll practice more, they're making more progress, their motivation will build, and that's when online teaching actually starts to work. So with that said, when we look at the actual lesson itself, the weekly lesson that you have with the student, this is where your job is clarity. Now, for context, I taught drums online, which is about as technically complicated as it gets. And this is where the framing of online sessions needs to change a little bit. People always ask, how do you deal with the sound issues? And the short answer is you kind of minimize the amount of time spent playing with the student in the actual session. Like I said, the moment you try and recreate that in-person playing vibe online, you're going to run into problems. There's always latency, there's always audio issues, and you end up having to rely on the student having a great setup as well, which just creates more frustration. I'll get into how we give feedback and adjustments in a little bit, but just taking the session itself, you don't need to be watching the student practice for an hour. They need to leave that session with a plan. They need clarity on what they're working on and how they're meant to execute it, right? Those sessions work best when they're simple and they're focused and they're really efficient, and you're just giving them the information that they need, explaining it clearly, and making sure they leave with a practice routine they actually understand. One thing this approach did for me is it also forced me to get much better at explaining things. When you can translate what's in your head into something clear and digestible in a lesson, everything becomes smoother. There's less friction, there's less confusion, more follow through on things. So in this kind of online teaching setup, the session is really about setting up the week. Do they have the practice routine? Do they know how to execute it? And do they understand the principles behind what they're working on that week? When the answer is yes, to all three things, the rest takes care of itself. Now, another thing that separates online coaching from normal teaching or in-person teaching is the support you provide in between the lessons. When there's no support between lessons, it puts a huge amount of pressure on the lesson itself. It feels like that session has to do everything because you won't see them again for another week. When you add even a small amount of support in between, that pressure really disappears. And a lot of the time, that support is just responding to one or two questions the student might have. I'll give students access to my WhatsApp, whatever. So if something's unclear, they can just ask me. They can send me a message. And if I can fix a problem for a student in a 1 or 2 minute phone call, for instance, I'd much rather do that than let it sit there for a week. That alone helps keep them on track and massively improves accountability. But the other big piece is feedback, right? Instead of trying to solve every technical issue live in the lesson, we frame what needs to happen in practice. They go away and work on it. And then midweek, I'll say, look, send me a short video of you doing this. That's where the real adjustments can actually happen because now I can see what's actually going on when they're practicing. Technique might be slipping here. Maybe they need to adjust the tempo of something, right? And it's clean, right? They're just sending me a video. There's no latency. No setup, real-time video stress. Those two things together, right? Light, ongoing support and feedback on their practice and execution are what turns this into coaching. You're no longer just focused on the lesson every week. You're calibrating in real time, making small changes, and keeping their progress moving. And that provides far more value for the student. Now, there is one important caveat here. If you're teaching children, this only works if the parents are involved. Now, if you want to use this kind of coaching approach for teaching children, you absolutely can, but there's one thing that has to be true from the outset. Teaching kids online only works with parental involvement. It's a non-negotiable. Kids don't control their practice. They don't really control their schedules, right? They don't control the environment that they're practicing in, but the parents do. So if the parents aren't involved, practice won't happen, right? Progress will slow down and lessons just turn into babysitting every week. That's still true online, right? And honestly, it's true in person as well. Online just makes it more obvious, right? So parents don't need to sit in on every lesson and micromanage what's happening, but they do need to be aligned. They need to know what the focus is that week. They need to understand what practice looks like, right? And you need to be communicating with the parent just as much as the student. In this setup, the parent becomes your kind of main point of contact. And when the parents are involved, practice will be more consistent, progress is easier to see, and teaching just feels much lighter, right? It also gives you something really important from the outset. It lets you screen for the right students. If you're speaking to a parent who just wants to drop their kid in once a week and hope for the best, that's not going to work, right? And no format will fix that anyway. Parental involvement isn't just about making online teaching work. It's about working with the right students, right, in the right environment from the beginning. Having taught hundreds of students using more of this coaching format, I can say with confidence, this setup isn't just better for the students, it's better for you. You're no longer just selling an hour-long lesson, you're actually guiding someone's progress across the week. And because of that, sessions don't even need to be a fixed length, right? The focus isn't on the clock or the time input. It's on the outcome you're helping the student get. Just that alone takes a huge amount of pressure on the individual lesson itself, and you're not trying to cram everything into 1 hour. You're setting direction and letting progress happen in between the sessions. There's also a lot of flexibility, right? You've got check-ins, you've got feedback, and you can do a lot of this remotely. And that's one of the best things about teaching online. You can respond when it's suitable for you, and teaching starts to fit around your life and not the other way around. And because this approach provides more value, it justifies a higher price. So you end up teaching fewer students, getting paid more, and enjoying the work a lot more. So when it's set up properly, online teaching definitely isn't a compromise. It's genuinely better. I've got another video where I break down a few of the tools that I use to actually teach online that I honestly couldn't live without and makes it really, really easy. So make sure to check that out here.